Hello, everyone. Welcome to the third session of our Fostering Research Integrity guest speaker series. As you can see, I'm presenting here today. So I'm Sean Lacey, the university's Research Integrity Compliance Officer. We just had a change in speaker, so we don't have an external speaker. So hopefully you'll survive with me today. We've had, in the last couple of weeks, we've had two very interesting talk presentations on export controls and research security. So Professor Kim Murphy from Southeast Technological University spoke on export controls and very much gave a nice overview of export controls, which was very interesting. And then following that, then we had Dr. Elaine McCarthy from Maynooth University, who gave a lovely overview then of research security. So what I'm going to just try to focus on today then, as opposed to reiterating content that was in those presentations, is just kind of looking at how is this potentially going to be done in practice here for us within the university? Because the previous speakers kind of give us the overview to kind of share the idea of how important it is. So how are we going to do this on the ground, and who does it actually impact as well? And I won't take slides that others have used. I say that with the exception of this very first slide, because I thought that this was a nice slide that Elaine shared with us in the last session, and what they showed, and this just focus on research outputs in terms of publications to who we kind of collaborate with, and this was something that was taken from Saival and Elaine shared with us in the last talk. Now, I just thought that this was an interesting one to start this off with because it just shows, like, obviously we do a lot of collaborations within Europe. But we do, you look when you look at this graphic, you can see we do significant amount of collaborations outside of Europe. And again, these are talking about publications, but we collaborate in many different forms in research as well. And there's many different research outputs beyond publications as well. But this just gives a sense that we do collaborate outside of Europe, which then gives an idea that export controls are important to us and research security are actually important to us. And that's really why I thought this was a nice graphic to start off with. So when it comes to these points, then I think it was just useful maybe to see, look, what is the relationship between research security and export controls, and how does this sit in all the other things that we have ongoing in the university? And I suppose specifically, I suppose when I think of in the area of research integrity and compliance, we have research integrity, we have research ethics, we have open science. Like, where does this all sit? So when we look at the overarching topic of research security, and I'll share a couple of slides in this later on as well, this is where we're just looking at the broad element of collaborating outside of Europe. Okay, and what does that collaboration look like? And even outside of Europe is a bit kind of maybe a bit too broad there as well. And we'll talk a bit more about that now in this one in this session as well. But when we are collaborating, like how secure is our research in that area? And that collaboration could be by doing conference presentations. The collaboration could be by being a visiting fellow to a university, or actually receiving a fellow coming to us as well. So it's kind of quite broad to what that collaboration is. But if that collaboration then ends up dealing with some research outputs that could be used for dual use purposes, or could end up having or used for military purposes, then that would be export controls. So research security is kind of our overarching term, and then export controls sits underneath that. And I don't say underneath in any way to minimize it at all like that, because export controls, there's legislation around export controls. There's no legislation around research security at the moment. So you could say export controls is smaller, but it's that there's a legislative mandate with that. So that's actually really, really important. So it's not to say one is more important than the other. They're both equally important. It's just to kind of see where they actually sit together. But then equally, and this is something I thought Elaine really spoke very well to in their second session, is like if we are, I suppose, conducting our research, following the good practice, following our principles of research integrity, a lot of the work around research security and export controls, they follow because we're doing that due diligence. We have that awareness. We might need to go an extra step because of export controls, or an extra step because of research security. But essentially, research integrity, research ethics, open science, they all speak to this. So this is not that research security is this standalone thing. Like, to a certain extent, we've been doing research security. It's just obviously have this more of a formal name to it of recent. But I mean, if we're conducting our research well, and we have been down through the years, then research security has always been taken care of. There's just additional attention drawn to it at the moment, and rightfully so also. So what I'm going to do here for this talk is I'm going to focus on export controls, give a couple of slides in it, going to give an example of export controls and how we would review this on in practice, and then I'm going to talk about research security as well then. So a bit of text here, but the slides you can see there was a link popped into the chat there, so you can download the slides. So the slides can be a bit of a read material later on. But here is the definition of export controls, and I'm not going to read out the whole definition. It's there for you to read. But this is taken from the Department of Enterprise, Tourism and Employment, and this is the definition that we will be using in the university around it. And I just thought what was useful when it was coming to export controls, essentially what it's calling out is the non-proliferation. Now, I know I don't have the none highlighted there, but it's there. That you're looking at concerns around national security, you've concerns around foreign policy, and you've concerns around human rights. Now, if you're thinking of like where does ethics, as an example, where does ethics sit in it? But when you're talking about ethics, you're automatically thinking of human rights. So, I mean, if you're conducting research ethically, to a certain extent, export controls is related to that then as well. Obviously, it adds on another layer to it, but it's not this whole completely new thing either as well to a certain extent. Okay. And yeah, perfect. So then it comes to like what is an export? Okay, so an export is quite broad as well. Okay, so I've got this lovely graphic. I say lovely now. I got this from Copilot, so I mean it's open to interpretation to whether it's lovely now or not. But anyway, what we're talking about here for when we're talking about an export is any transfer of goods, technology, or technical information typically from Ireland from Ireland to outside the EU. But that can vary, and you can see now in the example that I will look at later on. Sometimes we might have the transfer of information inside of the EU, and that could also require export control licensing as well. So we will touch on that as well. And also then it can deal with kind of something that's tangible of where you're physically transporting something, but it also can deal with that digital transportation, where we could be transferring things over email, doing presentations at conferences and stuff like that. So it's not all about kind of that tangible thing. It can be sort of digital as well. So when it comes to the actual export controls, there are principles that we need to kind of keep in mind. Okay, so I'm just going to pop up the 8 principles that we look at nationally and internationally when it comes to export controls. And these are very much informed by that definition that I popped up earlier as well, which is where we have concern around national security. So it is important for us that we are protecting national security. So we look at we prevent the export of goods or technologies or information that could be used to enhance military capabilities or threaten our country's security. Then we look at non-proliferation. So non-proliferation is where we don't support efforts we don't support efforts to spread weapons of mass destruction or anything related to weapons of mass destruction. Then we have economic trade interests. So this is where we're looking at protecting our own domestic industries. We have human rights. I think that kind of speaks to itself. So it's where if we're conducting our research or and innovation, that it's not going to have a negative impact on participants' human rights. We're looking at foreign policy, that when we are exporting, that it's not going to be against our own actual policy around, I suppose, strategic alliances and what is kind of recommended through, I suppose, in terms of our government's objectives as well. There's transparency and compliance. So it's like that when we are collaborating with colleagues, that there is that open kind of culture and that transparency and compliance and awareness around exports and what can and can't actually be done. And then there's technological safeguarding. So technological safeguarding is where we ensure that any cutting-edge technologies are not exported without proper authorization, which are ultimately protecting our own IP in those areas as well. And then finally, and I say finally, but it's not that there's a weighting to any of these, it's adaptability. So adaptability is where we always need to keep abreast of actually situations around export controls, around regulations, around policies, around and compliance with this, because no different to in other topics within research, it doesn't stay fixed. It evolves over time, and it can be impacted by different things that are going on globally as well. And it's important for us to kind of say, look, whatever's happening now, that we're aware of it, but we need to kind of keep up to speed with things as they evolve over the next weeks, months, and years as well in that area. Then it's a case of, right, so that's kind of, it was to a certain extent, kind of a lot behind the scenes, but like, what does that mean to us on the ground, okay? So we have an export controls webpage, and on that export controls webpage, we give just, I suppose, screening questions for researchers or for end users to be thinking of, or is export controls applicable to them? So, and then these two questions then can kind of help inform where you're going next. So will the work involve the export, transfer, shipping, or electronic transmission, including email, of any controlled items, software, equipment, technology, technical assistance, or know-how to persons or entities located outside the EU? So there's obviously a lot there now to that. I mean, there's nearly kind of questions within questions there to this. But essentially, if when you're reading this, like if you feel that you fall into this bracket, then that's kind of that this is seen as a screening question, and it's important then that you'd follow up with your head of function, or you reach out to the research integrity and compliance officer, or there's a dedicated email to this address to this that can help support how we'd actually manage this. There's another screening question that we'd have up on the webpage as well. Are any collaborators, funders, or other work participants located in or affiliated with countries subject to EU, UN, or Irish sanctions? You can read the rest of there yourselves. And so that would impact the technology, that impact technical assistance, know-how, and to such recipients as well. So again, very broad. There's so many different parts to that. But then this is something for you to kind of reflect on and say, look, is your research, is your innovation kind of linking in with this? And if it is, if it's yes to any of these questions, either the first or second or both, it is to notify your head of function of this that this is the case, and it is to reach out to the RICO through the export.controls@mtu.ie email address as well. And it goes from there. Now, on that webpage, and I won't screen share there, but on the webpage, we do mention about it's important to have training on export controls, and there's a link there to where you actually can get it training. So we have a subscription to Epigeum here at NTU, and under Epigeum there's a research integrity specialist module for specifically on export controls that you could link in with, and it's very good to kind of give you I suppose a broad foundational awareness to export controls and the potential impact for yourselves as well. That training typically, and it would depend on how you progress through it, but at most that would be an hour's training. But it can really just give you a solid foundation to, is export controls applicable to you? If it is applicable to you, how do you manage these things as well? And I will talk about that now as well, also here, but it's no harm to actually have a small bit of training yourself as well, especially when you're reaching out to either your head of function or to the RICO, that at least you're reaching out with some kind of being some way informed as well and some bit of awareness. You still may be unsure whether export controls is applicable to you, but at least you've done maybe your own kind of form of due diligence on this, and that you still have questions as well. Categories to be aware of, and so I'm going to give two examples of these then as well. But when we're looking at, I think it's kind of clear cut to a certain extent if something maybe is being used for military purposes, but if something is being used for dual use. So dual use is where it can be used for good. You might be conducting your research and you're using some product or some technology for good use. But if that technology or that product falls into other hands, then it could be used for military purposes. So that's where that dual use element comes from. And what we have in the legislation is we have 10 categories, and they go from category 0 to category 9, but there are 10 categories around awareness for dual use. And these categories would start off with 0 being the most serious, and then they de-escalate the way further you go down. But nonetheless, category 9 is something, if you're involved in aerospace or propulsion, that is obviously something that could require an export control licensing as well. It might not as either. So it's not a case of that we're doing work on computers and we automatically need export control, a license. It depends on what that actually work is. And so when it comes to these 10 categories, each of the 10 categories then are broken down into these 5 sections. And I'll give 2 examples now on kind of how we would interpret this. So then these sections would be around obviously systems, equipment, and components, materials, and technology. Which one of these situations do you fall into? And I was at a recent training session by PwC, and they gave some very nice examples of kind of suggestions on implementing that last slide that I just put there. So I'm actually going to take 2 examples that they use to just see, look, how do we actually manage this? And I would think as a researcher, you can go so far with this. I mean, you could actually start this kind of thinking process, and then you come to the RICO or to your head of function with kind of this question mark saying, actually, I think there could be export controls because if I check A, B, C, I'm ticking those boxes. I think we need to be looking into this. And maybe when you look into it, it turns out that you don't need an export control license, but at least it's something then that you've checked out as well. Okay, so the example I'm going to use, so this is the first of 2 examples that I have. So a research fellow is due to spend several months working in a nuclear power plant in France. and will use their research on pressurized water reactors to help improve operations there. Okay, and essentially, is this secondment? So it's basically the researchers going to France. So it is a secondment. Is it a secondment export controlled? Okay. Now, as I would look at that, I suppose the one thing I would see here is I'm talking about France. So I'm within Europe. So export controls, everything we hear about export controls is when you circulate something outside or you're exporting outside of Europe. So that would be kind of be thinking, no, I shouldn't need that. But then the other side of it then is we're looking at a nuclear power. Okay, and if I have a small bit of awareness around export controls, I know nuclear, I'll go back to the previous slide, is actually mentioned in category 0. So that's the main kind of category, the most serious type 1, okay? So I'm thinking, right, there is something there though around nuclear, so I should do my due diligence on this, okay? So then if I look into it, so the tangible is like, what is the output here? Like what has actually been happening here? So what we're looking at here is a pressurized water reactor. Now, this is not my background at all. Like I'm basically looking at the wordings here and how this would link into legislation that exists as well. Okay, so we're looking at a pressurized water reactor and a type of light water nuclear reactor, and that's just the blurb that we have up above. Okay, and obviously we're doing this looking at 3 or 4 sentences. If this is your research, you have a lot more than 3 or 4 sentences, but this just hopefully give you an idea to how we navigate through this. Okay, so then if we go back to our categories, okay, so where are we this? Well, if we look at our 10 categories, well, we're talking about nuclear reactors, so we are actually in category 0. What are we doing in terms of nuclear reactors? Well, we're looking at the use, we're looking at the operation. So essentially that would fall under this, the section of systems, equipment, and components, okay? So what we have here is category 0 and section A. Now, I would think as a researcher, we can do this, okay? We don't necessarily need to be au fait with the whole legislation, but we should be able to kind of do this kind of bit of classification ourselves. I'm going to share it on the next slide now. I'm going to share the legislation. I mean, you don't have to obviously read the whole thing out here, but how do you navigate your way through it? Because it's a massive document, but how do we navigate our way through it? So if we look at the next one here, is this a tangible controlled product? Essentially it is, okay? And I'm going to talk through the referencing of this. This is a nuclear reactors are controlled under this code of 0A001 lowercase a. Now, what does that mean? So the first 0 relates to category 0, which is what we said on the previous slide. The uppercase A relates to section A, which was that systems and technology. Excuse me. If we go to the legislation on this, and the legislation is there on the left-hand side, so you'll have a link from that. If you go to the legislation, you can see here 0A is in that category. So we found that, okay? We found that by just going through that previous slide. And then if we just redo a small bit of reading, we can see that the category of 0A, then 00001, and then the first bullet point is lowercase a, and that's where that code comes from. Now, I'm not saying that everyone needs to be able to code these things at all. I'm just saying, look, that there's a certain logic to this. But ultimately, I would think that 0A is a code that we should be able to kind of figure out ourselves to kind of then all realize actually there is a potential concern here. I would think as a researcher, this will be enough then to kind of say, look, I need to kind of definitely ask some kind of questions. Now, equally, beforehand, you could be asking questions. But if you're coming to this point here, there is something in the legislation now around this. Now, this is where then you need to contact the expert on this to kind of get further guidance. And that expert, initial local point of contact here in MTU is the RICO. But the RICO, and I speak that from me being in that position of the RICO, will be collaborating with colleagues to actually work this out, and colleagues in the innovation and enterprise office, colleagues in legal as well, to make sure that when we're progressing this, that we are actually moving this in the right direction as well. If this is not a case of, oh, yeah, well, maybe some things are obvious, maybe some things are obvious, but things can often be in a gray area, and the technicalities are actually very important here. Okay. The last thing maybe on this, and I suppose, again, it's not to overwhelm anyone with this last slide. I suppose it was more just to see that there's a certain logic or there's a certain flow to this, and hopefully that makes sense as well. But the bit that kind of would get me a small bit is we're still talking about France, okay? And there is this again, this is where I would feel the expertise is required as well. So there is a definition around the use of technology, and this is called out in the legislation as well. And it's also called out then also that some member states require licenses or prior notifications even for transfers within the EU. I mentioned a bit more text there. But basically, France is one of those member states. France is one of those member states that require this, even though that there is only the transfer within the EU. So when it comes to this actual movement, this is within the EU, so that would be called intra-EU movement. This would actually be where a license is required in this case. Now, there's a lot there, and I do feel that it kind of gets technical towards the end. I wouldn't feel anybody needs to feel alone that they need to kind of reach this point. I would think it's at kind of going back to the start, asking that kind of question, those two screening questions of yourself, maybe just having a bit of an awareness around the legislation and how we do these kind of categories. And when I say awareness around the legislation, it's not that we go expecting everyone to read the legislation. By all means do. I'm not saying you don't read it, but it's more to say, look, how do we navigate our way through it if we have a particular category with a particular section? To do one more, and again, I got this from PwC as well. It was the training there last week. I liked this example because this talked about publication. And obviously, in research, that is something that we do, because when we're doing research, we're looking at generating new knowledge. Part of the journey then when we generate new knowledge is we want to share that new knowledge. How we share, one avenue to share is obviously a publication. There are obviously other avenues to share, but I just thought this was a nice example here. So a researcher has published the design concept, so has already published the design concept of an unmanned aerial vehicle, which has the endurance of 1 hour, 10 minutes in an academic journal. And there's a particular example there. Now, the specifics are actually very important. Like the endurance there of 1 hour, 10 minutes is actually quite important, okay? And you'll see this now in the next couple of slides that I have. And I know that if you download the slides from Zenodo, you don't have some of the bits that where I'm going. That's mainly just to kind of, so you're on the journey with me here, as opposed to maybe reading ahead for those kind of examples. But so is this publication controlled? So, well, what's the output here, or what's the tangible? Well, the tangible is an unmanned aerial vehicle, which is essentially a drone, that kind of idea. That's what a drone would be an unmanned aerial vehicle. When you look at an unmanned aerial vehicle, well, what category would that fall under? Well, that would fall under the category 9. That would be aerospace and propulsion. That would be the category there. And what section are we looking at? Actually, it's the same section as we did before, which is where there's systems, equipment, and components. Okay. So then we go to our slide deck. Sorry, not the slide deck. We go to our legislation. And what do we find here? So the code that we have here, if you go look at this kind of the sentence I have, 9A012A2. Okay, so very long-winded. How do we make sense of that? I would just think how we make sense of that at the very start is we're talking about category 9, section A. That kind of gives the bit of flow. And then if you go to category 9, section A in the legislation, you get all these examples. And then what you'll see, category 9, section A, then there's a subsection of 012, which is basically the 12th component to that. So that's where the 012 comes from. There's a bullet point A, and then underneath that bullet point A, there's two parts. There's a 1 and a 2, and we're looking at the second one. And we're looking at a situation of where there's an unmanned aerial, what's that? UAV, what's the V mean again? Jeepers, sorry, I'm after getting a block there on that. The V is, I didn't realize I was going back. So vehicle, sorry.
Vehicle.
Thanks very much. I was thinking now people are screaming at the screen there now with me there with that. But anyway, so what we're looking at is this vehicle, unmanned aerial vehicle, and it has a maximum endurance of 1 hour or greater. That is something that would require licensing in this case. Now, there's a flaw here now with this one, and we'll talk about that in the next slide. Now, the thing is then, well, what if it was less than 1 hour? Okay, so we were talking about basically a drone that was 1 hour, 10 minutes. What if it was less than an hour? So the bullet points above say, if you're dealing with something that has a maximum endurance, I don't have it highlighted here, but it's bullet point A and B, a maximum endurance greater than or equal to 30 minutes, but less than an hour, and something else. So if you only have a drone that falls under 1A, that wouldn't be enough for licensing. It needs to be 1A and B collectively. Okay, so if you had a drone, we'll just say that it only would work for 10 minutes. That wouldn't be something that would require licensing. Now, at the same time, like you could be saying, look, am I interpreting? I'm not, if I'm the researcher, am I interpreting that correct? I would really think, like, if you're the researcher, don't necessarily be putting yourself into that position. By all means, do your homework, do your due diligence, but you then go to somebody and then say, well, I'm looking at category 9, section A. I'm a bit concerned. I think I'm okay, but I'm not 100% sure. And you want to kind of get that clarification. And that takes that pressure off you to kind of say, oh, I need to be making a call on it, because you don't need to make the final call on it. And if it comes down the route that you need to get a licensing, The university does the license for you. It's not that you're left completing the form by yourselves. The university does the license with you to make sure that the form is completed, but it's not that a researcher is left high and dry or you need to go off and do your export license yourself. This is obviously because of the impact of it and the legislation around it. It needs to be managed through the actual university with that as well. Okay. So this one, then this is kind of the bit of a blurb then afterwards. So here it is basically something that needs licensing. Now, the problem here with this one is, I mean, and I suppose I'm thinking, what's the background story here? There's a publication. There was no mention of the licensing in the publication. So really, this paper should never have actually been published. It should actually have been stopped earlier in this case. Like just because something has been published, that does not now mean it's fair game. If there was an export licensing required for it, it should never have gone to that whole publication route. There should have been controls and stops done in brief beforehand. But that's an issue then in itself, how that will be managed. Okay. So that last bit though, and I've just a couple more slides. I just want to touch on research security as well. Won't go into the level of detail around it as export controls, because with export controls we have legislation around that. While research security, it is still an evolving topic. Even though it's the broader term, it's still evolving. Even export controls is the smaller section, but because of the legislation, it's a lot more clear cut how we're actually managing that as well then. Okay, so when it comes to research security, I'll just pop up a definition again to how we'd see this, and I'll highlight some text on it in a second. But essentially, maybe just before I highlight kind of a bit of the wording on it, like where is this all coming from? And essentially, the European Council back in May 24 made recommendations to enhance research security. Given that we, Ireland, are a member state of the European Council, the fact that the European Council are saying that there's these recommendations to enhance research security, we in Ireland then need to be doing this. Then us, MTU, being a part of Ireland, need to then follow through on it. And that's where this is actually all coming from. So it does stem from that recommendation from the European Council in May 24. Now, this has been done internationally for years before. And when I say years, I don't mean like 10 years, but Canada and so have been doing a lot of work on this in the last 5 years on research security. There have been other countries as well. Even within Europe, I mean, there's Finnish colleagues have been doing a lot of work on this, but it's more that the European Council got behind it in May, and that now means other countries now all need to follow suit if they're being member states of the European Council. So here, what we're looking at for the research security is where we're trying to prevent the undesirable transfer of sensitive knowledge and research data, as well as ethical and integrity violations. Now, that speaks to dual use, but dual being export controls, but that's only a component of it. We could be looking at sharing our information and we might have a breach and maybe lose our IP. Now, that IP might not be around in military purposes, it might not be around dual use, but it's definitely a concern, and that will be a research security concern in that case as well. Okay. Here, I thought I'd just flag this. I was at a conference in Brussels at the end of May. It was a flagship conference on research security in Europe, and so it was around sorry, did I say May there? I meant October, and it was around the launch of that conference. Then it came out from the European Commission around how they're actually looking at research security being embedded into law and looking at the European Research Act as being an avenue for that. Now that's I mean, that's not fact yet, as in that hasn't been implemented. But it's my point. I just thought it was interesting to show is that these are conversations that are happening, and if something ends up being implemented through the European Research Area Act, so the ERA Act, that does have implications and it will trickle down as well. So it's just, I suppose I thought it was interesting just to share, look, that these conversations are happening international as well. When it comes to principles of research security, I'll just pop these up here just to give a sense of, look, what are our principles here? Essentially, when it comes to research security, it's institutional have autonomy around this. So M2 can make decisions to, we want to collaborate with colleagues in a particular university that are outside of the EU, even though there may be a question mark around that university. The university has that autonomy to do that if they want. And that's a principle of research security. And this will be called out in the recommendation guideline document that comes from the European Council as well. But it's important then that when we are collaborating with colleagues outside of Europe, and to a certain extent, it filters through that. It's kind of nearly a principle like how you collaborate with colleagues outside of Europe would not be consistent with inside Europe. So it's not that outside Europe there's a whole of a massive, a step change. I mean, essentially, it's good practice, hopefully, that we're doing throughout. But essentially, that we're doing responsible collaboration. Okay, so we're looking to promote and encourage international cooperation in research and innovation that is both open and actually secure. And that's important. That's where the open science comes from, is we do want to share things openly, but there needs to be a security element around that as well. Actually, I did pop up too many there because it just gives a bit of focus. It's a risk-based approach. So it's not that there is avoidance of risk, okay? And it's not that as a university, we're allergic to actually risk, but there should be a case of managing that risk. And it could be, so it's not risk avoidance, it's risk mitigation. So how do we kind of scale down particular risk if there's going to be collaboration involved? Because sometimes you may need to take risk to realize the potential of an opportunity, but it's just about managing that risk, really, more so than anything else. It's integrated governance. And what that means is the topic of research security, obviously it says research. So it's the case of, that just falls to the people in the research and innovation sector, sector being, the VPRI. That's not the case here. Like research security touches many facets of the actual university, both in the academic circles or in the administration and in finance as well. So it isn't just a research and innovation problem. And I leave it at that. It's not that. It is a wider thing as well. It is important that when we are looking to collaborate, I'll put these two ones up here, that we are not looking at, I suppose, being discriminating against any particular countries, that it's not, I suppose, saying, let's avoid a particular country. There needs to be evidence or rationale for actually how we make these decisions. And in a lot of the cases, and it's important to kind of say this, then when it comes to kind of making these decisions about if we're going to collaborate with colleagues in particular universities, is there a concern there? We may not have the evidence around the intel around is collaborating with colleagues in a particular university concern. That's something that would nearly have that has to happen nationally, so that there would be national guidance on that. And nationally, there would be an opinion given about a university in a particular area that they're potentially a red flag, and then it's for the university to decide, do we progress then or not? But sometimes when it comes to, I suppose, that screening of research and of universities, that's not to be done locally. And I'd say that based on the experience of engaging with colleagues across Europe at this conference that I mentioned there last month, is in the Netherlands and the UK, they're doing a lot of work on research security. And what they have is within the HEIs, they have points of contact that you can go to kind of field any, in those kind of preliminary or kind of triage questions. And I have them coming up on a slide now. But then if there's potentially a concern or you need more information, it goes nationally for that final kind of input. Now, it's not that somebody nationally then says, you can't do that. They'll give an opinion, and then it's for the university to make the decision then after that as well. And then the last thing when they talk about principles of research security, it's to have an awareness. And always to be kind of an awareness to look, I suppose, how things are actually changing. And I would ultimately feel that that's what we're trying to even do with these Fostering Research Integrity series that we have this semester, is we are building that awareness around export controls and around research security as well. So we have a web page on research security. It is very much an evolving topic, but we felt that it was important to kind of, in that whole awareness culture, to be building that awareness, and we felt a web page to be signposting people to, and to kind of get them to encourage them to kind of reflect on some questions to maybe their research collaboration. So there's 5 questions up on the webpage that could be just of interest here. So to think of, like, could my research have dual use or sensitive applications? So dual use is obviously our export controls. Sensitive applications isn't necessarily export controls that I need to consider more carefully. Am I confident that collaborators, partners, or funders do not introduce security concerns for my project? Am I sharing research data, materials, or information in a way that is safe, whether the exchange happens in person or digitally? Have I thought about the security considerations involved when I host a visiting researcher or when I'm visiting a researcher elsewhere? Again, these are questions to think about, and it could be a case of, we'll just say, you're going to be a visiting researcher. Do I need to be, I would say, it'd be easier if I say I'm going to be a visiting researcher. Are there things I need to be thinking about here? And it's to kind of go and ask these kind of questions. look, I mean, maybe not the majority of the case is maybe not, but there can be instances of where there's something that you need to be concerned with. It doesn't mean that you can't be a visiting researcher. It's a case of though that you'd manage the risk around that, depending on what your actual research is as well. And I think that is important. And it's really something I would stress is it's not that things cannot progress. It's just that they're done in a controlled way and somewhere that mitigates risk and it doesn't avoid risk. So, and then the last one, have I met all my relevant ethical, legal, and institutional responsibilities that relate to research security as well? So there are questions to kind of just be thinking of, and it could be a case of you don't know, I think I am, I think I'm not. Like, how do I kind of get this information? And that's kind of where you start asking the questions where you maybe, if you're a research student, you start talking to your supervisor, or maybe if you're a staff member, you start talking to head of function, or you reach out. We have an email address, it'll be popped up on the screen there in a couple of minutes of research.security at MTU for those questions as well. Okay. Last thing then, I just thought the export controls, it was kind of there was examples, those two examples that we got from PwC. I'm very much kind of around the mindset that it's about seeing the practical side of things, like how do these things actually look. So basically, trying to do something similar to finish off this session, felt I just put up a dilemma, okay, to see how do we manage this, okay. So I am part of a multi-institution research project that involves sensitive human participant data. A collaborator at another university has asked me for access to my datasets to help with analysis. The data are de-identified, but the datasets include metadata that could inadvertently reveal information about participants or institutional processes. Okay, so we basically are. I'll keep it to myself. So I am collaborating in a multi-institution research project, which is definitely something we're encouraged to do here in the university. It involves sensitive human data. That's not a reason not to do it. I mean, if it involves human data, I'm assuming I have the research ethical approval done that. And as part of that, there would be awareness around data management. Hence, you can see, look, it's being de-identified. So would feel that I'm doing everything kind of right, in-house here, which is all fine. But now I'm looking to potentially collaborate and share data. What do I do here? So so a couple of options, and these options, none of them are perfect. And I'd always say with these dilemmas, it's kind of the catalyst for a kind of a conversation. You can see there with the QR code, if you scan that, you could just kind of say, look, which way you'd be inclined to go. And it'd be just interesting just to see what colleagues would be thinking of here. So I should share the full data set immediately via secure digital channels to maximize collaboration and project efficiency, trusting that my collaborator will handle it responsibly. Which sounds lovely, I should have a reduced or partially anonymized data set that limits potential risk, but may slow progress and require additional coordination. I should delay sharing until formal data sharing agreements or institutional approvals are in place, risking project delays and possibly straining the collaboration. I should refuse to share the data digitally and instead collaborate through indirect means, for example, sending aggregate results or working on separate copies, which could protect sensitive information but reduce the effectiveness and speed of that joint research. So there's a lot there. There's more in the kind of the responses than the blurb above. And I'd always feel, for me, it would take a couple of reads for it to kind of to sink in. But essentially, I'll try to paraphrase here as best as possible. The first one here is you'd say, yeah, let's plow on and let's start sharing the data. There's a trust element there. The second one there is you share a part of the data. And it would be anonymized data set, but the data is de-identified anyway, so that helps. But you're sharing part of the data. The third one is you don't do anything until there's formal data sharing agreements in place or institutional approval. It obviously depends on what you're doing to which one of those would need to be. And obviously there's a knock-on effect that will delay things. Or you refuse to share anything and you're going to do workarounds where you might, instead of giving data, you get summary, you kind of give your graphics, your summary statistics, you might give other different outputs and stuff like that. But you feel that that's worthwhile to protect the sensitive information that you have. What do you think? Okay. So I'll give my opinion just at the end, like it's not my opinion, there's a right answer here. Like there's concerns with each one of these, but if you had to pick, like which way would you kind of go for this one here? And I should have it here. So and what I do then is I'll just call out just kind of the responses that we're kind of getting here. So, and let me know if the Menti poll isn't working, but hopefully it should. And if it isn't working, I can pop a link into the chat. If the QR code for some reason isn't working, just let us know. Okay, so what's coming in here now at the moment is nobody's saying A or B, and we have a few that are going towards C and D in this case. Okay, and we can see there's a strong leaning towards C here, and then a small bit towards D, and nobody's saying A and B. Okay, I'll just give it another couple of seconds, then we'll close off then. Okay. Yeah, so we're looking at roughly rounding off the percentages there nicely for this. We're saying 80% of E are saying C, and 20% are saying D. Nobody's saying A or B. Okay. Like if you look at A, like that's a lovely thing kind of to be able to think of. Look, that you could there's that trusting element there. But obviously there's definitely a chance of being taken advantage of with that. It's lovely to do because you can kind of jump in and do the collaboration, which is a very exciting time of research, is that kind of collaboration and the learning around it. But there is definitely a lack of control there with that, and or safe, I shouldn't say control, but it's more security around that. So that even though there's a positive side to it, the reality is we needed a bit more security around it for A. For B, I would think like I would just personally, and I suppose I would think this now with kind of a real kind of a stats head on, that would be my background. What is a partial data set? Like, I mean, you either have the data set or you don't. Like a partial data set, you're kind of neither here nor there because you can't reproduce anybody's work with a partial data set. So I couldn't see the benefit of doing B personally. Doing C, I would be leaning towards C. I mean, it is good practice to have data sharing agreements. We're encouraged here in the university that we have research data management plans, that we kind of clarity around how we're going to be managing our data. But when we're collaborating with partners externally, that we have data sharing agreements. There could be institutional approvals required, depending on what the research actually is. Obviously, the risk of not, I do say the risk, I suppose the risk of that is that it does delay things. But to a certain extent, like this, I would always kind of say good practice does take time. You know, cutting corners doesn't take time, but then that's where you could get burned later on. You know, while if we do good practice, follow good practice, it does take time, but then it's something that we can have confidence then later on in it. So in terms of D, I suppose I would just say like maybe me, and look, maybe that's what it depends on what the research is. I would think it's kind of like this partial collaboration, and I think it doesn't help with the trust element there, that you're kind of potentially saying, look, I can only share this amount of information. Well, why can't you share everything? While if you look with C would be kind of, you could really signpost, well, this is what's done nationally, or we're encouraged here in the university to have a data sharing agreement in place. I love to collaborate, but we need to have this done first. So that would be kind of a quite I think a familiar thing or a normal thing to kind of say, look, if we're going to be collaborating in research, there should be a data sharing agreement. And I mean, if the person is dead against that, that's nearly a red flag in itself. Do you know? So if I had to say, I would be leaning towards C, definitely more time with it, but you reap the rewards then later on. And look, on that note then, that's where I just wanted to finish with this. So I've mentioned there about culture of awareness and build kind of signposting. So we have two web pages, one about export controls, one on research security, to kind of get people thinking about both topics. It is only natural that like those web pages don't cover everything, that there could be follow-on questions that you may have, maybe concerns that you may have, and we have those email addresses that you can reach out to, and we can then go from there as well with that. Okay. And I suppose it would just be important to say, like, especially as with these, like if you were maybe reaching out for kind of a question, it's kind of allow kind of a response time there, especially around export controls. There's important topics. It can't necessarily be, oh, a quick reply within 5 minutes. This could take time to tease out to kind of get an initial reply, and that initial reply may be that you need more work. So it ideally would not be the case of, oh, I'm going to a conference tomorrow. Do I need an export control license? Ideally we wouldn't be going down that route. Okay. But look, that's the end of this session. I'm very happy to take any questions that anyone may have. Thanks very much.